My body feels so weak, I can barely make it up the plank. Climbing up from the depths of this darkened place, the light hurting my eyes, such a strain to open them, such a strain to focus them. It's almost as if they forgot how to work. They feel like I'm using them for the very first time. The sun feels so good on my body, a welcome friend that has been gone for too long. The air is fresh, blowing the stench from my nose, but periodically being hit with the reminder of that hole of death. My body goes from hot to cold with the soaking of the seawater against it.
Greetings. My name is Louise Dente, and I welcome you to yet another edition of Cultural Caravan. On this edition is a special as we look at a very important work entitled The Passage, Stories of the Maafa. And we're joined by the writer, producer, director, Brother Jawanza Bakari. And next to him is Dr. Tyrene Wright. She is an author and an educator. Welcome to Cultural Caravan. You know, Jawanza, I had the pleasure of seeing your work, which is over 10 years old, based on a book. Basically about 10 years ago when you produced it, and you had a powerful cast. I know recently you reintroduced the work again, and you had one of the original actresses, Kimberly Craig, actually directed. And it really just took the work in another level. So let's first tell people about what the work is about. Can you give us a snapshot of what the work, The Passage, Stories of the Maafa is about?
Sure. The Passage, Stories of the Maafa is a collection of poems that were written to describe and to express the African Holocaust of enslavement in the United States.
Now, when you think about that, and you know, right now we're at a very interesting time in our sojourn. Of course, we're in the midst of a pandemic that's really just had a phenomenal effect on the world. We also are in a situation where there's a whole explosion of protest across the country, across the world, as relates to police brutality. And the slogan, Black Lives Matter, has become a national as well as international slogan as relates to looking at our lives. And all of this really stems from the brutality that we and our ancestors endured during the enslavement. So when we talk about what your work represents, when you think about now, when you wrote this work years ago, what was the inspiration? Did you see it? And what has been the response? Let's start with the inspiration again.
I first saw the production at St. Paul's Baptist Church, the Maafa. Reverend Johnny Ray Youngblood did a production, a very bold production. I never saw anything like it in my life. It inspired me to do the same. I'm a poet, among other things, and I decided to want to contribute. What inspired me was to share a story, to share a history, to share a perspective, to share a respect for our ancestors, to share a responsibility we still have today. As far as tying it to today, we have to understand what happened to the Africans. The enslaved Africans were made to feel less than human beings, as if they were less than human. They were made to feel like they're the lowest thing on earth. Animals were treated better than Africans were treated, enslaved Africans were treated. This is a continuation of the struggle from back then to now. The cry is still the same. We're still human beings. We're still human beings. So, and to be accepted as human beings. So as far as the time frame from the end of the Civil War, 1865 to today, not much has changed along those since. They're still wanting to be accepted as human beings.
Mm-hmm. In terms of, there are people who may say, come on now, that was back then. Why are we talking about slave narratives? It's the 21st century. Why are we still there? There are some of our people.
Well, unfortunately, the sense is that the fact we still are there, even though this is the 21st century. Again, the acceptance of being as a human being, wanting to be acclaimed as a human being, the things that are happening now, the atrocities that are still happening now, happened back then too. We have to understand the connection between history and what's happening today. There's no separation. It's all cyclical. So what's happened as far as back then, they had slave catchers. Those slave catchers or patrolmen later came to be the police. So it's the same system. We're still functioning out of the same system. So if you want to act like that has nothing to do with today, it's built on what's happening today. There's no separation.
Now we're going to see a clip from the Maafa, or I call the Maafa, but the passage, stories of the Maafa.
Why one day when Master was coming out of one of the water, he slipped on some goat dung and went flying. And came right down up in the goat stuff. The his hat went one way and his wig went the other. Now everybody's seen it, but nobody dare laugh. And all of a sudden, a great jolly laugh could be heard. It was loud, and it was hard. Then they seen the bounce off of the trees. But this time, nobody joined in. And it became more hollow with each chuckle. I beg Master, forgive him. He only 8 years old. I said, Master, I'll take his lashes. I told Master, I'll punish him real good. Master just say, get the whip and gather the rest of the niggas.
That was powerful. I mean, when I look at the work, you've actually taken some real gripping slices of the historic of the brutality of our ancestors. Can you explain basically what went into creating this work for you?
It was just an understanding of looking at us today and understanding how we got to be where we are today. I understand certain issues that came up as far as the brother had a problem with as far as accepting himself as a person. He saw himself as an existence through the lens of his master, and that was challenged when he had to make the decision to beat his son at master's request. It's just a lot of understanding. I'm a history buff, so I wanted to be able to express these things that happened to us so we can understand why we're facing the things we're facing today. So that's what all really went into it.
I just wanted to take our audience to another scene from the work, which again takes us back to that time. Again, let's look at a scene from the passage.
I am not sure which way I want to go. Not sure which way is relief for me. Weak moans and the sound of the sea fill my ears. Moans for help and moans of death. Eventually it moans. You come to sing. Moans for help. To help them to die. To help them to die. To escape this torture. After so many weeks, I too joined in the mournful singing. I too beg to die. Into 6 weeks, I beg to in this nightmare. Between life and death.
You can't help but just to wonder what it took for our people to endure the type of brutality that they faced over and over again. And the spirit of our people, and for that, I just want to again to introduce another guest, Sister Tyrene Wright, Dr. Tyrene Wright, an educator. I just would like for you, Dr. Wright, to share with us, particularly giving us a context of what enslavement was in terms of the American story, and why aren't we getting a balanced story of what it really was and its impact.
The history of enslavement in this country in particular would have been characterized by the fact that it was chattel enslavement, right? So the first type of slave system that in essence made the enslaved property, not human, anti-human, dehumanized the individual. So not simply a system of slavery where you're in servitude, which the world has known, okay? Slavery has existed throughout the world, and usually at the hands, people experience enslavement at the hands of their own people. What is unique about the American paradigm and context is that enslavement in the United States would be characterized as chattel enslavement, chattel slavery, where you were the equivalent of a table, a shoe, a desk, an animal in essence. So you were dehumanized, right? And that's part of what the seasoning process was for the whole system, meaning to break human beings and make them accept the imposition of enslavement, right? So very often, some of the African people who were enslaved in the United States were brought to Cuba and seasoned and then resold back into the United States, where they were dispersed to various plantations. But enslavement in the United States would dehumanize African people, but also strip them of their culture, strip them of their language, right? So we all know famously, right, the story of Alex Haley's ancestor roots, where he wants to use his indigenous, his original name, Kuta Kinte, and it's beat into him to call himself Toby. So, of course, linguistic domination, which this is what we're experiencing right here. I'm an African person. We all are, we are identifiably African, but we're speaking English. Linguistic domination is what we experienced, but also, so the inability to practice one's culture. Now, not to say that we have not had little pockets where we have maintained our culture and have preserved African culture, but for the most part, African culture became erased, right? As erased as possible. But also you had the domination of our bodies, not having control of our bodies. So forced reproduction, okay? And so you have a double down of selling of Africans into enslavement from the upper South, right? Maryland, Virginia, into the deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, which, you know, doubled the number of enslaved persons and forced the population to explode to supply labor for cotton, right? And in these places, of course, it was complete domination. You had a desire, even internationally, when Europeans engaged in imperialism, to try to recreate this colonial South, which engaged in complete domination of the African person. So no linguistic celebration of your own culture, no ability, no retentions in that level, no assertions of one's own humanity, right? Denial of relationships, destruction of a family, all right? So men and women could not marry because they were viewed as property. Exactly. Right? Your children weren't your own because your child became property. Exactly. Right? So those are some of the defining characteristics of American enslavement. It denied African people relationships.
Exactly. I want to go back for a moment, Brother Jawanza, in terms of the response to your show. As people are sitting in the audience, what have been some of the responses that you've seen?
As far as responses, a lot of people felt the pain, felt the torment. More recently, I've started to see people get a bit more angry. And I had to make sure they understood that it's not about getting angry. It's about understanding what happened and taking on the responsibility to pick up where they left off. But that's been the response pretty much. We had mixed audiences too. We had people of European descent come, and they loved the production. You know, they felt very comfortable being there. And it's not just for us, it's also for them too. They need to understand what happened to us or what was done to us too. You know, not so much for their approval, but basically, so it's just an understanding of the responsibility they have to make sure it doesn't happen again too.
Exactly. And certainly, you know, when you think about this, as you said, this is part of American history. This is important that this information be understood by every child, by everyone, regardless of what our people particularly, but everyone, including Europeans and others, also understand it. And even new arrivals, because I think that people who are just coming into the culture need to understand the African American experience and why and how this has impacted us, particularly being under this. And you think about 400 years of being under servitude and this the length of time. And I'm just going back to what our sister has talked about in terms of the impact of enslavement, but let's talk about the impact post-slavery. What has been, would you say, sister, what is the enduring legacy of enslavement on the African mindset?
The residual of enslavement on the is on the mindset and is the result of the enslavement. The trauma is what has been left with us overwhelmingly, right? Trauma that has gone unacknowledged though. And so that's very problematic, right? Because it's intergenerational. So when we experience such a traumatic and violent, because the institution of slavery, if we were just talking about slavery itself, it probably would not be as impactful. But once again, what's so unique about enslavement in the Americas and specifically in the United States is this reality of chattel slavery, right? So the dehumanization, right? So how can someone not be human? And so all the atrocities that come along with asserting this system on human beings, right? And claiming that they're not human, right? So the beatings, the rape, the separation of family, right? So the loss that people aren't able to grieve. I think right now it's interesting. We're getting a chance to see once again people grieve and not really have space to grieve. They have loss, but they're not having the space to grieve. I think it's very reminiscent of some of what we experienced historically in this country. Separation, right? Due to COVID, right? But separation from loved ones and not being able to honor that separation. So a lot of that is the residual of enslavement. But also, too, I think one of the things that is very important to discuss is the material residual. The legacy of enslavement on the African population in America is poverty. And poverty causes its own. Poverty is violent. Poverty is cold, it's cruel, it's unkind. And so that has been the material legacy of enslavement, okay? Perpetual wealth was created for people who identified as whites and created this institution and maintained this institution of enslavement, and perpetual poverty for the descendants of the Africans who were enslaved. And the perpetual poverty is still in existence now.
So when we think about the fact that the impact of enslavement, the impoverishment, the fact that unfortunately, statistically, our people are not getting even the amount of money, not being paid the same amount of wages, or are not being given the same quality of education, or being basically continue to be given less than. And now there is a cry, a national cry for what is reparations, that our people really realizing that, hey, you know, we started at a deficit, you know, where is these 40 acres and a mule? And even at the time of this taping, there is a national movement for reparations organizing across the country. Talk about that briefly. I know it's a bigger conversation. We're going to talk about it another time. But when we talk about reparations, what are some of the things, and I'm going to ask both of you to think about, and I'm going to ask my brother here first. When you think about what the tragedy, when you did the research and you actually put us front and center with some of the uglies of enslavement, what are one, if you think about two things that, when you think about reparations, what that would be, what would that be for you that you think that the society should consider doing to repair the damage?
Well, there has been situations in this country where people have received reparations. The Japanese, we look at the Jews, what happened to them in the Holocaust, during World War II. They were paid back financially. They were rewarded financially. But I do definitely agree we do need to be reimbursed for our labors and the atrocities that happened to us. But the greatest atrocity that they cannot pay back, and which we must put the work into, is retaining our sense of a being. That was taken from us. Not to go too far back, but the sister made a point. There's a point in the play where it says they made about living. The burden was being African. They made African to be a burden, to the point now we reject ourselves. We do not love ourselves. We see ourselves. We can't see ourselves being human beings as being Africans. We see ourselves as being human beings through Western culture. People don't take African names on. They won't name their children African names like that. You have people make comments that, well, I'm glad my ancestors were captured because, I would hate to be in Africa now. So that we're better off being here in the United States, not understanding what would happen to us, as so. But definitely financial reimbursement, and also I think we need to be able to build institutions for ourselves that celebrate ourselves.
Well, yes, I have to reiterate financial, of course, because what enslavement did was, in essence, rob people, African people, of their labor, and they were in perpetual slavery. So that meant there was no possibility of freedom. So that is very problematic. Okay, can you imagine being in perpetual, no freedom in sight? So of course, monetary. But land is the basis of freedom, okay? Because with land, you can do all the things you need to do for self to make you whole. So land would certainly be, there was enormous land grants given to various European groups, even European immigrants, right? So those coming at the turn of the century from other places, but certainly white settlers, Anglo settlers, right? As the West is settled and so on and so forth. So land for sure. And then of course, really be quite frank with you, claiming your humanity is something that it's going to have to be an internal job for us to do, right? But the goal is always to be free, to walk this earth free of negation on every level, whether that's here in America or on the African continent or Central and South America. And so just claiming our right to not just our bodies, but to this world.
As we conclude this discussion, I just want to, first of all, go back to you, Brother Jawanza. When you think about what your work, and again, none of us know the history and how it sits right now at this very critical time where we're dealing with a pandemic and also dealing with racial unrest. What is it that you want our people to take away from this work? And where would you like to see us 5 years from now?
I would hope they would get a better understanding. We would get a better understanding of what we went through, the strength we had to persevere such obstacles and such atrocities and still be here today. That's the amazing thing. We're still here. And to carry on the struggle they left us with. We don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. Mm-hmm. The wheel's already been invented. What we need to do is improve on the wheel. So the message from 1865 should not be the same message as in 2020. If we're doing the same thing over and over again, and every 50 years finding ourselves in the same place, something needs to be done. We need to look at it differently. We need to incorporate something else. Now, I salute the generation now is taking up the mantle. I salute them because they're out there and I'm not out there. But hopefully they'll take the time to look back and see what was done before and improve on what's going on now. And if anything I want to leave them with is so they can understand, in order to be, you must first realize that we already are. And that sounds simple, but it's more complex than that.
Sister Tyrene, I just want to, as we kind of focus in and looking forward, what would you like to see in terms of us, and I'm going to challenge you to about a minute or two, in terms of where you'd like to see this whole question of reparations and our people, if you say 5 years from now?
5 years from now, I would like to see a successful reparations movement where we have come to a conclusion about how we are going to claim our material compensation. I would like to see that sooner than in the next 5 years. But when you say us, I think of it as a little bit larger, right? Us as African people in this world. I would love to see the connections between Africans in the United States in particular and African people on the continent working together to move towards a unified Africa. Yeah, because that's the place.
Absolutely.
That's home.
Absolutely. You hit it on the head. Well, it's so much, and certainly this conversation could go on, and I'd certainly love to continue it at some point. And I want to thank you both for joining us, because it's so important that our people give some context to where we were at, why, go deeper beyond these atrocities that we're seeing and see the bigger picture and where it all began. And it did begin on the slave plantations of America. But until next time, I want to thank you both. I hope you've enjoyed this broadcast, and we continue to encourage you to tune in, to write, and to tell a friend. But until next time, Louise Dente saying thank you.